The ash of Thorn Manor did not merely coat the floor, it acted as a heavy grey shroud for a history that the High Council had tried to incinerate. It was a cold Tuesday morning, and the air tasted of ancient soot and damp stone. Lady Alara Thorn sat amidst the blackened ribs of her ancestral library, her fingers stained not with soot, but with the permanent, indigo ghost of ink. The library had once been the intellectual heart of the Thorn lineage, housing thousands of volumes on law, history, and the arcane mathematics of the treasury. Now, the shelves were nothing but charcoal ribs, and the smell of burnt vellum hung in the damp air like a lingering accusation. She did not shiver. She did not weep for the tapestries that had once told the story of her lineage. Instead, she counted the rhythmic drips of water falling from a cracked vaulted ceiling, measuring the decay of her house with the precision of a clockmaker. The silence was absolute, a private art of survival she had perfected over the months of her exile, until the heavy thud of military boots shattered the stillness. Duke Kalen Northwood did not announce himself with a herald. He entered the ruin like a winter storm, his silhouette framed by the jagged remains of the doorway. His cloak was a deep, bruised crimson, heavy with the scent of pine and horseflesh, a sharp contrast to the monochrome death of the manor. He was a man built of scars and silence, the illegitimate Iron of the North, who had carved a path to the Regency with a blade that knew no mercy. The scar on his jaw was a silvered line of history, a jagged reminder of the siege of Ironhold, twitching as he surveyed the wreckage. It was the mark of a man who had survived the worst the world could throw at him. Yet he stood now before a woman who possessed a different kind of scars, ink-stained fingertips, and the cold, hollow gaze of the dispossessed. He stopped 5 paces from where Alara sat upon a charred crate, his winter-grey eyes scanning the desolation before resting on her straight, unyielding spine. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer an apology for the wreckage. Without a word, Kalen reached into his belt and withdrew a heavy cylinder of parchment. He threw the map of Valerage onto the stone floor between them. It unrolled with a dry, rasping sound, revealing a province of sun-drenched vineyards, rolling hills, and golden coastlines. It was a masterpiece of cartography, every vine and villa rendered in exquisite detail. The Duke's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant rasp, conditioned by years of commanding men across frozen tundras. 1 year as my Duchess Alara, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. 1 year to legitimize my claim before the High Council, to bridge the gap between a bastard sword and an ancient house's name. In exchange, Valerage is yours. You will have your anonymity. You will have your peace. Alara looked down at the map. The gold leaf on the borders glimmered in the pale light, a mocking reminder of the wealth she had lost. To any other woman in the kingdom, this was a rescue. It was a chance to trade a tomb for a garden. But Alara Thorn did not see a sanctuary. She saw a cage constructed of fine vellum and pretty promises. She cast no glance at the Duke with gratitude. She did not reach for the deed that would grant her a life of quiet safety. Instead, she stood, her bombazine dress whispering against the grit of the floor. She stepped forward, her muddy, worn boots treading directly onto the center of the sun-drenched province, the damp earth from the Thorn ruins staining the painted vineyards. The map was not a piece of parchment. It was a contract of surrender, and Alara Thorn was finished with surrendering. I spent my life in the dirt of this ruin, Kalen. She spoke, her voice level and devoid of the tremors of a victim. I am not looking for a garden to die in. I am not looking for a quiet corner of the world where I can hide the ink on my fingers and wait for the council to forget my name. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze a sharp, intellectual blade that refused to be blunted. You need my name to bypass the Lex Regia. You need the Thorn blood to silence the Archprelate Valerius Hallowell. But you are a soldier, and you are playing a game of numbers with men who own the mint. You will lose the Regency within 3 months because you do not understand the architecture of power in Aethelgard. Kalen's jaw tightened, the faint scar running across his cheek twitching with suppressed irritation. He was used to the fear of his subordinates and the fawning of the court, not the cold, analytical dismissal of a woman living in a soot-stained tomb. "And you believe you can prevent that?" he asked, his tone bordering on a challenge. "You are the daughter of a house branded for heresy. You have nothing but ashes and a name that carries the weight of a curse." "I have more than a name," Alara replied. her hand moving to the heavy black-bound book tucked into the folds of her skirt. "I have the one thing that can bring the High Council to its knees without a single drop of blood being spilled." She held his gaze as she stepped off the defiled map, her posture as rigid as a marble column. "I do not want Valerage. I do not want a year of pretense followed by a quiet disappearance. I demand the throne beside you. I demand to be recognized as co-sovereign, bound by the Crimson Covenant. We will rule as equals. Or you will walk into Aethelgard alone and watch your regency crumble under the weight of debts you do not even know you owe." The air in the ruins seemed to thicken with the weight of her demand. It was a matter of stewardship, not of sentiment. Kaelin looked at the muddy boot print on his map, then back at the woman who had dared to negotiate with a conqueror from a position of total ruin. He saw the ink stains on her fingers, the mark of a woman who understood the ledger of the world. He saw the lack of fear in her eyes, a stoicism that matched his own. For the first time, he did not see a pawn. He saw a strategist. Elara reached into the hidden pocket of her cloak and produced the Thorn Ledger. It was a heavy thing, bound in leather that felt like cold, cured skin, and closed with a brass lock that required 3 distinct turns of a hidden dial. The Thorn Ledger was not a book of numbers. It was a record of every lie the royal treasury had ever told, a map of every bribe, every frozen fund, and every illicit transaction that had fueled the High Council's rise over the last century. Elara opened the book to the middle section, where the ink was fresher. "Here," she said, her finger tracing a series of encrypted columns detailing the crimes of the council. "Master Silas Vane has been diverting 30% of the royal grain tax into an offshore fund held under a pseudonym. The High Priest has authorized these transfers in exchange for the Church's immunity from the new tithe audits. This is not just gold, Kaelin. This is treason rendered in arithmetic. If you walk into that council chamber without these numbers, they will present you with a bill for a war you did not start and debts you cannot pay. My father did not die for forbidden knowledge." "Kaelin," she whispered, her voice like the scratching of a quill on parchment. "He died because he understood that in Aethelgard, gold is a ghost and debt is the only true god. I have the names, I have the amounts, and I have the legal precedents that will make our marriage unbreakable." Kaelin stepped closer, the smell of wood smoke and old paper swirling between them. He looked at the book, then at the woman holding it with the reverence of a priestess. "You speak of the Crimson Covenant," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "That is an ancient ritual, Elara. It is a bond that merges 2 houses into a single legal entity. It cannot be annulled. It cannot be broken by anything short of death. You would bind yourself to a bastard whose enemies are as numerous as the stars. I would bind myself to a man who has the strength to hold a sword while I hold the pen," she countered. "You have the military might to defend the walls, but I have the financial leverage to ensure the walls are never sold from under you." The Duke watched her, his analytical mind weighing the cost of her demand. He had come for a wife of convenience. He had found a partner of necessity. He knew the council would never accept him alone. He knew the Archprelate Valerius was already preparing a decree of insolvency against the Northwood estates. Without Elara, he was a king of dust. "Very well," Kaelin said the word, sounding like a final hammer blow on an anvil. "We sign the covenant. But understand this, Elara. Aethelgard is a city of serpents. Once we cross those gates under a shared banner, there is no retreat. You will be as much a target as I am." Elara did not flinch. She did not hesitate. She had been a target since the day her house burned. She reached for a small silver dagger she kept hidden in her sleeve, a relic of her mother's vanity that she had sharpened into a tool of utility. She did not use it for violence. She used it for the finality of the law. She moved to a stone plinth that had once held a bust of a Thorn patriarch and cleared away the grey dust with a single, decisive sweep of her hand. She laid the Thorn Ledger upon the stone and opened it to the final blank page of the Thorn section. The ritual was not a matter of emotion, but of the most binding form of accounting. Elara pricked the tip of her finger, the small scarlet bead of blood looking like a ruby against her pale skin. She did not wince. She did not cry out. She pressed her finger into a small well of indigo ink she had prepared from crushed galls and soot. The indigo galls reacted with the iron in her blood, darkening the fluid until it was the color of a bruised twilight. This was the Crimson Covenant, the ink of blood and law. She began to write, her hand steady, her script a perfect flowing copperplate that detailed the terms of their co-sovereignty. She wrote of the Lex Consortia, of the shared regency, and of the mutual immunity that would prevent either of them from ever testifying against the other in the council's truth trials. When she was finished, she handed the quill to Kaelan. He took it, his large hand dwarfing the delicate instrument. He did not hesitate. He mirrored her action, adding his own blood to the mixture. His signature a jagged, powerful mark that anchored the contract to the earth. As the ink dried on the parchment, a faint, crystalline hum seemed to vibrate through the stone of the ruins, a sign that the ancient laws of Aethelgard had recognized the union. The covenant was sealed. The map of Valoridge lay forgotten on the floor, a discarded bribe for a woman who had just seized an empire. It was not a marriage of hearts, but a marriage of ledgers, a merger of military force and financial absolute. Elara closed the thorn ledger with a heavy, satisfying thud. The sound was not a conclusion. It was the first beat of a new heart for a dying kingdom. She looked at Kaelan, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than cold calculation in his eyes. It was respect. It was the recognition of a peer. "We leave at dawn," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier predatory edge. "My men are waiting at the edge of the thorn woods. They expect a bride in white, Lady Elara." "Then they will be disappointed," she replied, her voice ringing with the quiet triumph of a woman who had just rewritten her own fate. She looked at the black bombazine of her dress, the color of morning and of night. "I am a thorn. We do not wear the colors of surrender. We will enter Aethelgard under the black banners of the ruin, and the council will know that the ledger of their lives is finally coming to an end." She stood amidst the ashes, a plain woman in a dark dress, holding a book that was heavier than any crown. She had been invisible. She had been undervalued. She had been cast out with nothing but a ruin, but as she studied the Duke, she knew the restoration had already begun. It was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of mathematics. The debts of the past were being called in, and Elara Thorn was the only one who knew the exact price of redemption. Tracked by the precise gears turning in her mind, the one-year term of their marriage had just become the first year of a dynasty. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply tightened her grip on the thorn ledger and walked toward the light of the doorway, leaving the defiled map of Valoridge to be consumed by the rising dust. The road to Aethelgard was a ribbon of grey gravel winding through ancient forests that felt like watching eyes, heavy with the silence of centuries. Duke Kaelan Northwood had wanted her to travel in a closed carriage, a black painted box of anonymity intended to shield her, or perhaps to hide her, from the predatory gaze of the capital. He had spoken of security and of the vipers that populated the royal capital, his voice a low rasp of military caution. Lady Elara Thorn sat in the corner of the velvet-lined carriage, the thorn ledger a solid, comforting weight against her thigh. She watched him through the small, slatted window as he rode his black charger, his crimson cloak snapping in the wind like a wounded wing. He was a man who understood the geometry of a battlefield and the direct, brutal logic of a blade. But he did not yet understand the physics of a debut. He thought her presence was a vulnerability to be managed. He did not realize that a thorn in the shadows was a victim, but a thorn in the light was a reckoning. As the spires of Aethelgard pierced the morning mist, the air grew thick with the smell of coal smoke and the briny, sharp breath of the river. The city gates were massive iron-studded arches of granite that had stood since the first kings of the Aethelgard line. To Kaelan, these gates were a fortification to be held, a bottleneck of defense. To Elara, they were the first page of a ledger that had been forced shut with blood and fire, and she was the only one who possessed the key to open it. Kaelan pulled his horse level with her carriage window as they neared the shadow of the great arch, his face a mask of iron discipline. "We will enter through the north gate," he said, his voice dropping to a register that allowed for no dissent. "My men will form a perimeter. We will move directly to the Northwood townhouse. You are to remain inside until the council summons is verified and the legal framework for the marriage is finalized." Elara did not agree. She did not argue. She simply looked at him, her eyes as calm and impenetrable as a winter lake. "A matter of presence, Kaelan, not of concealment," she replied softly. He frowned, the silvered scar on his jaw tightening in a flicker of suppressed irritation, but The forward momentum of the military escort forced him to turn his attention back to the road. He assumed her silence was submission, a common error made by men who mistook patience for passivity. It was his first mistake of the day, and it would not be his last. As the carriage wheels rattled over the uneven cobblestones of the inner city, where the commoners gathered in the hundreds to witness the return of the Iron Bastard, Alara stood within the moving cabin. She reached for the heavy neutral curtains that Kaelin had insisted remain drawn. With a single sharp motion of her ink-stained fingers, she tore them back. Hidden within the inner linings of her travel cloak, she had pinned the black silk banners she had salvaged from the deepest unburnt vaults of her ancestral manor. These were not merely pieces of fabric. They were the preserved dignity of a lineage the world believed had been ground into the dust of history. The banners unfurled, caught by the sudden draft of the city's narrow streets, billowing out from the carriage windows like the wings of a predatory bird. They were of the deepest, light-drinking black, embroidered with the thorn sigil in silver thread that caught the pale morning sun. A compass rose with a needle of cold iron. The crowd, which had been murmuring with the usual chaotic energy of a homecoming, fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. In Aethelgard, these black banners were a myth, a ghost of a name that had been purged for hoarding the secret arithmetic of the Empire. To fly them now, at the side of the Duke who sought the regency, was an act of high regency defiance that transcended words. Kaelin's charger reared as he saw the black silk dancing against the grey granite of the city walls. His eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and shock, his hand reflexively going to the hilt of his sword as he realized what she had done. He was trapped by the geography of the street and the density of the onlookers. He could not stop the carriage without creating a riot or a public scandal that would feed the council's gossip mongers for a decade. He could only ride beside the black banners, his crimson cloak now appearing like a subordinate accent to the void-like darkness she projected. The daughter of the Thorn line had returned, not as a beggar seeking a province, but as a sovereign claiming her rightful place in the architecture of power. She paid no mind to the crowds. She did not wave. She simply sat with a straight spine, measuring the rhythm of their gasps against the ticking of her own internal clock. When the carriage finally muffled groaned to a halt within the inner courtyard of the royal capital, the air seemed to have grown 10 degrees colder. Alara stepped from the carriage, the heels of her boots striking the ancient granite with the finality of a gavel. 1, 2, 3. She counted the rhythms of her own progress as she crossed the vast expanse of the courtyard. The space tasted of damp stone and the faint, cloying scent of incense drifting from the cathedral spires. Kaelin dismounted, his movements stiff and armored in a silence that was more jagged than usual. He did not offer her his arm. He simply walked a half-pace ahead, his posture a wall of repressed frustration. They entered the great hall, a cavern of vaulted ceilings where the whispers of guards echoed like the skittering of rats. Every 40 paces, a torch flickered in a brass sconce, casting long, distorted shadows against the tapestries of forgotten victories. Alara noted the tension in the air, the way the palace servants pressed themselves against the damp walls as the black-clad woman passed. She ignored their stares, but she registered the temperature of the stone under her hand and the rhythmic clanking of the guards' halberds, a mechanical pulse that mirrored the counting in her head. 124 steps from the carriage to the threshold of the council chamber. A matter of distance, she thought, not of fatigue. The transition from the sunless streets to the high council chamber was a descent into a different kind of darkness. The chamber was a hall of polished mahogany and cold, white marble, where the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and the stifling weight of tradition. Archprelate Valerius Hallowell sat at the head of the crescent-shaped table, his white robes a stark hypocritical contrast to the shadows of the room. He was a man whose power was measured in whispers and the meticulous scratching of quills, and today, those quills were poised to write the final decree of Kaelin Northwood's political demise. The heavy oak doors swung open, the sound echoing through the vaulted space like the strike of a hammer. Kaelin entered first, his military boots ringing on the marble with an aggressive, rhythmic pulse, his posture a challenge to the 7 men who sat in judgment. But it was the woman who followed him, who held the room's collective breath. Elara moved with a measured grace, the train of her black bombazine dress whispering over the stones, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tomb. She did not look at the councillors with the wide-eyed fear expected of a ruined lady. She did not seek their pity. She counted them: 7 men, 2 governors of the royal mint, 3 prelates, 2 lords of the northern borderlands. She noted the visible sweat on Master Silas Vane's brow and the predatory, serpent-like stillness of Valerius. The archprelate did not stand to receive them. He leaned forward, his heavy gold rings clicking against the mahogany table with a sound like bone on wood. "Duke Northwood," he began, his voice a smooth, oily tenor that carried the sting of an insult. "You bring a guest to these sacred proceedings, a breach of protocol that we find intriguing. We were under the impression you sought a private hearing to discuss your unfortunate insolvency and the suspension of your northern tithes." Kalen opened his mouth to speak, the heat of his anger visible in the sudden tension of his jaw. But Elara stepped forward before he could utter a single syllable of military bluster. She did not curtsy. She did not wait for the formal introduction that Kalen would have likely fumbled. She placed the thorn ledger onto the central table, right between the archprelate's folded hands, with a heavy, deliberate thud that made the crystal inkwells shiver. The ledger was not a book of accounts. It was a weapon of historical retribution. "I am not a guest, archprelate," she spoke, her voice cutting through the stuffy, candle-warmed air with the precision of a surgeon's knife. "I am Lady Elara Thorn, the Duchess-elect of the North and the last scion of the lineage that founded the royal treasury. By the Lex Consortia, my presence is not a request. It is a constitutional requirement for any session regarding the regency or the financial standing of a sovereign house." She looked at Valerius, her gaze a cold, analytical audit of his composure. "You speak of insolvency as if it were a natural disaster. Yet, you fail to mention the 400,000 crowns diverted from the Northern Borderland Defense Funds to the Hallowell private endowments in the last 3 months. The room froze in a silence, so absolute it felt physical. Master Silas Vane's quill snapped in his trembling hand, a dark blot of ink spreading across his parchment like a growing stain of guilt. Valerius's eyes narrowed into thin slits of venomous light, his face pale against the white silk of his collar. "That is a heresy of numbers, Lady Elara," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You speak of records that were incinerated with your father's library. You have no standing to accuse this council of anything but stewardship. Records are not so easily incinerated." "Valerius," she countered, her hand resting on the heavy brass lock of the ledger. "The truth has a way of surviving the fire, when it is written in the blood of those who understood the cost of every coin. My father died for this book, because it is the only true history of this city's greed. You thought you could hide behind Kalen's lack of administrative experience. You thought you could bury a soldier under an avalanche of artificial debt and legal technicalities. But you forgot that a thorn is never more powerful than when she is in a room full of thieves who have forgotten how to count." Kalen watched her from the periphery, his hand slowly moving away from the hilt of his sword. He had spent his life winning battles with iron and the raw strength of his will, but he was witnessing a different kind of warfare. A quiet, intellectual siege where the weapons were legal precedents and a perfectly balanced ledger of sins. He saw the way the councillors shifted in their seats, their collective arrogance beginning to fray at the edges of her stoicism. She was not merely the bride he had bought. She was the silent architect of his survival. The throne he had come to claim was no longer just a seat of military command. It was a kingdom she was rebuilding, stone by stone, through the sheer force of her competence. Elara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "According to the records of my house, this council is not sitting in judgment of the Duke's debt. This council is currently in arrears to my lineage for the illegal seizure of the provincial mints during the Great Purge. If you wish to discuss insolvency, Valerius, we can begin with your own." The archprelate sat back, his mouth working silently, as he searched for a rebuttal that did not exist. The black banners she had flown through the streets were no longer just a shock to the populace. They were a shroud being laid over the council's corruption. Elara did not smile. She simply stood with her fingers resting on the ledger. The ticking of the clock in the hall, marking the exact moment the balance of power in Aethelgard shifted forever. The rain came to Aethelgard in the 3rd month of the regency, not as a gentle spring mist, but as a cold, rhythmic drumming that turned the palace courtyards into pools of slate-grey ink. It was a relentless, methodical downpour that tasted of coal soot and wet granite, a weather that favored the patient and punished the impulsive. Within the gilded halls of the royal capital, the atmosphere was equally suffocating. The High Council, led by the silent hand of Archprelate Valerius Hallowell, had finally struck their first decisive blow against the new administration. They did not use swords, and they did not resort to the messy business of a street riot. Instead, they used the quiet, lethal logic of a quill. A decree of strategic asset freezing had been issued under the guise of an emergency audit, effectively cutting off every copper intended for Duke Caelan Northwood's armies at the northern borders. Lady Alara Thorne watched the rain from the narrow, lead-paned window of her study, her fingers tracing the silver lock of the Thorne ledger. She did not pace the room. She did not wring her hands in the performative distress expected of a duchess, whose husband's men were now starving in the mud of the frontier. She counted the seconds between the lightning and the thunder, measuring the distance of the storm, with the same cold precision she used to measure the depth of a rival's debt. Caelan was at the barracks, no doubt surrounded by logistics officers, who could tell him exactly how many days a soldier could march on half rations, but could not tell him how to conjure gold from a frozen treasury. He was a man of iron, built for the direct geometry of a battlefield, but even iron became brittle when the heat of administrative sabotage was applied with such calculated focus. A matter of liquidity, Alara thought, not of courage. She turned from the window, the black bombazine of her skirts whispering against the stone floor. She knew that Master Silas Vane, the governor of the Royal Mint, would be attempting to leave the palace through the secondary garden gate to avoid the growing crowd of angry merchants at the main entrance. Silas was a man who lived in the margins of ledgers, a bureaucrat who believed that if he could not see the consequences of his signatures, they did not exist. He was about to learn that, in Aethelgard, the most dangerous thing one could sign was an entry that did not balance. She found him in the rain-slicked courtyard, a narrow space of clipped hedges and weeping willow trees that felt more like a cage than a garden. Silas was hunched under a heavy wool cloak, his boots splashing through the puddles as he hurried toward his carriage. He was 54 steps from the safety of his coach when Alara stepped from the shadows of a stone archway. She held the Thorne ledger against her chest like a shield. "Master Silas," she spoke, her voice level and sharp enough to cut through the din of the rain. "You move with the haste of a man who has forgotten to carry the one." The governor froze, his face turning a shade of grey that matched the overcast sky. "Lady Alara," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the heavy carriage that sat waiting for him. "I was merely. The council's decree is a matter of law, not of my personal discretion. The funds are frozen, pending a full investigation into the Northern Tithe discrepancies. Surely you understand that the integrity of the mint must be preserved above all else." Integrity is an expensive word for a man who has spent the last decade perfecting the art of the shadow account, Alara countered, her hand resting on the brass latch of the book. She stepped into the rain, the cold water soaking into her hair, but she did not flinch. She did not seek the shelter of the eaves. She remained in the center of the path, forcing him to look at her. "According to the records of my house, the mint has been operating under a system of circular tontines for the last 6 years. You have been using the interest from the army's payroll to cover the private gambling debts of the High Council members, including your own, Silas." The governor's breath hitched, a small, visible puff of white in the frigid air. "You cannot possibly know that," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and desperation. "My father did not merely record the gold." Alara replied, her voice dropping to a register of absolute mathematical certainty. "He recorded the friction. He recorded the millisecond delay in the transfers and the specific ink used by the clerks who forged the signatures of the deceased paymasters. I have the ledger of the 400,000 crowns, Silas. And I have the names of the 5 bankers who have been laundering the council's kickbacks through the Valeridge vineyards." The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic splashing of the rain against the stone. Silas Vane looked at the heavy, black-bound book in her hands. He realized it was not a record of history. It was a warrant for his execution. He saw the ink stains on her fingers and understood that she was not a lady seeking a favor. She was an auditor seeking a restoration. "If I release the funds, Valerius will have my head by morning," he whispered, his posture collapsing into the ruin of a defeated man. "And if you do not—" Elora spoke, stepping closer until she could smell the damp wool of his cloak and the stale scent of his fear. "I will present this ledger to the king's justiciar within the hour. You will be stripped of your titles, your property will be seized by the crown, and your family will spend the next 50 years paying back every copper of the friction you so meticulously harvested." She paused, letting the cold weight of the reality settle over him. "However, if you find a way to verify a series of private debt transfers I have already prepared, you might find that the Duke is a far more forgiving sovereign than the archprelate." Silas looked at the carriage, then back at the woman who stood in the rain. She possessed the straight, unyielding spine of a marble column. "What transfers?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "The personal debts of the High Council," Elora answered, her gaze unwavering. "You are going to help me buy the souls of the men who think they own this city." 2 hours later, the rain had settled into a persistent, miserable drizzle, and the air in Duke Kaelin's war room had become thick with the smell of wet leather and the metallic tang of unsheathed steel. Kaelin was hunched over a topographical map of the Northern Territories, his large hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly the old oak groaned under the pressure. The silvered scar on his jaw was a jagged, angry line in the flickering light of a single tallow candle, twitching as he looked at the red markers that represented his starving men. He was a man built for the clarity of a charge, for the honest brutality of a sword stroke, but he was drowning in the invisible mud of a political embargo. The map was not a record of geography. It was a graveyard for his reputation. He was already drafting a secret order for a desperate raid on the royal grain convoys. It was an act of high treason that would feed his soldiers, but would give Valerius the exact legal ammunition he needed to strip Kaelin of the regency and execute him for rebellion. He was a soldier trying to fight a war of numbers with a blade, and the cold, hollow realization was beginning to set in. The council was going to win without ever stepping onto a battlefield. The door to the war room opened with a soft, decisive click, and Elora stepped inside. She was still damp from the rain, her black dress clinging to her frame, but she moved with a quiet, measured grace that felt like the coming of a calm front. She did not speak of the weather. She did not offer him a hollow word of comfort about the state of his army. She walked directly to the table and laid a stack of parchment onto the map of the northern frontier, covering the markers of the starving garrisons. The Duke looked at the papers, then at the woman whose fingers were freshly stained with the dark indigo ghost of ink. "What is this, Elora?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp of exhaustion. "I am planning a raid that will likely end in our exile. And you bring me more paperwork." "They are not just papers, Kaelin," she replied, her voice cutting through the tension of the room like a cold wind. She reached out and fanned the parchments across the table, the candle light glinting off the official red seals of the Royal Mint. "They are the debt certificates of every member of the High Council. Archprelate Valerius, Master Sias, the governors of the borderlands. All of them." She looked at him, her eyes as steady as a compass needle. The Thorn Ledger was not a collection of memories. It was a mechanism of statecraft. Kaelin's brow furrowed as he scanned the documents, his analytical mind struggling to grasp the shift in the battlefield. "These are private debentures," he noted, his finger tracing Valerius's signature on a particularly large loan. "How did you acquire these?" "Even with your ledger, the banks of Aethelgard do not answer to a Thorn." "They do when the Thorn possesses the evidence of their own illegal tax shelters," Elora spoke, her hand moving to the map. "I did not ask the banks for a favor, Kaelin. I performed an audit. Silas Vane has spent the last 2 hours verifying the insolvency of the council members. I have used the Mint's illegally held reserve funds to purchase these debts in your name. You do not need to raid the grain convoys. You do not need to fight the council in the streets. You simply need to call in these loans." The Duke looked at the certificates, then back at his wife. He saw the ink on her fingers. This was the mark of a woman who understood that in this city, The pen was not just mightier than the sword. It was the mechanism by which the sword was paid for. He realized that while he had been preparing to die for his men in a blaze of doomed glory, she had been quietly, meticulously dismantling the financial foundations of his enemies. She had not saved him with a miracle. She had saved him through the sheer grinding power of her competence. A matter of ownership, Kaelin, not of combat, she added softly, her voice holding the rhythmic pulse of a clock that had finally found its balance. You thought they had given you a ruin of a name and a year of pretense. But they have given you the architect of their own defeat. Kaelin reached out, his hand hovering over the certificates before finally resting on Alara's. His touch was hesitant, the gesture of a man who had spent his life expecting the bite of steel only to find the warmth of a partnership he had not known was possible. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a pawn in a Regency game, but as the woman who had just conquered the capital from a room full of shadows. The Iron Bastard of the North bowed his head, a silent, private surrender to the intellect that had just rewritten his fate. We are not just allies, Alara, he whispered, the silver scar on his jaw softening. We are sovereigns, Kaelin, she replied, her spine as straight as it had been in the Thorn ruins. And sovereigns do not raid convoys. They collect what is owed. She looked at the map, where the red markers of his starving army now sat beneath the weight of the Council's own greed. The ledger was not just balanced, it was finally, irrevocably in their favor. Calculated by the silent passage of seconds in the war room, the hunt was over, and the reign had truly begun. She did not smile, but as she looked at the man beside her, she saw the first flicker of a future that was not a garden of anonymity, but a throne of absolute, earned power. The great hall of Aethelgard on the night of the Royal Anniversary Gala was a stifling masquerade of burning beeswax, expensive French perfumes, and the sweet rot of dying roses. Lady Alara Thorne stood near the edge, her black iron mask a cold weight against her skin. She did not dance. She did not socialize. She counted the oscillations of the crystal chandeliers, measuring the heartbeat of the room against the ticking of the massive grandfather clock. 1,040 guests, 300 guards, 7 exits. A matter of logistics, she thought. Her fingers tracing the edge of her silk reticule, where a cipher from her father's notes was tucked away safely from the prying eyes of the court. Duke Kaelin Northwood moved through the dense crowd, his military rigidity making his disguise almost redundant. His mask was a snarling silver bear, casting predatory shadows across the surrounding aristocrats. Built for the honest bite of a winter wind, he was trapped tonight in a theater of satin and lace. He caught Alara's gaze, offering a brief, silent acknowledgement of their shared burden. They were true sovereigns standing in a city that wanted them in chains. The scheming head of the church watched them from behind a white ivory mask, tracking the Duke with absolute patience. During the third movement of the Royal Concerto, Alara noticed a faint, foreign scent. It was a whisper of burnt sugar and ancient copper cutting harshly through the overwhelming floral perfume. Her father had taught her that lethal threats often arrived on the breath of a quiet breeze. She breathed slowly, forcing her pulse to remain perfectly steady. She identified the invisible peril drifting from the ornate brass ventilation grates. It was a quiet poison favored by the High Council for untraceable political erasure. In 20 minutes, the grand room would fall completely silent. In 30, the silence would be permanent. She looked at Kaelin, who was currently surrounded by a contingent of borderland lords. A whispered warning to him would trigger an immediate, violent military evacuation. That sudden panic would accelerate the physiological effect, elevating heart rates and ensuring a tragedy. Alara needed to clear the room, through the only mechanism the High Council could not immediately counter with violence. She needed a profound breach of social order. She required a scandal so devastating that the guards would be forced to remove the guests to maintain the king's dignity. Moving purposefully toward Kaelin, her black skirts whispered over the polished marble floor. She reached him just as the delicate music crested. You speak of the northern borders, Kaelin, while your debts at the palace remain unpaid, she cried out, her voice shattering the fragile harmony of the ballroom. Every head turned to witness the horrifying spectacle of a duchess berating her duke in public. Kaelin froze, instantly recognizing the 3 short, sharp strikes of her fan against her palm. It was their prearranged signal for a non-negotiable exit. Understanding the tactical shift, he played the wounded husband, his voice a low rumble of performed fury. "This is not the place for your petty grievances, Ilara," he countered with a menacing, slow grace. As the crowd backed away in horrified fascination, Archprelate Valerius stepped forward, his ivory mask gleaming directly under the chandeliers. "Duke Northwood, surely this tragic domestic dispute can be settled in private," he began, his voice thickly placating. Ilara turned her fury onto the Archprelate, her eyes blazing from behind her iron mask. "And you, Valerius, who keeps the records of his insolvency? Do you think the Thorn name was meant to be a charity for your council's endless greed?" The insult was a hammer blow to the evening's strict decorum. In Ethelgard, to speak of private debt at a gala was an act of absolute social terrorism. The scandal was not a failure of etiquette, it was a weapon of tactical extraction. The king's seneschal raised his staff, striking the marble floor 3 times. "This ballroom is closed. Remove the Duke and Duchess at once and clear the hall for the king's peace." The royal guards immediately hurried the murmuring, bewildered guests toward the great doors, eager to contain the unprecedented embarrassment. To the onlookers, it was a devastating public humiliation for the new Northwood marriage. To Ilara, it was the beautiful sound of 1,000 hearts being allowed to keep beating. She counted the steps until they reached the fresh, freezing air of the outer corridor. She had saved the Duke's life by setting fire to the fragile dignity she had spent months painstakingly building. The fallout was swift and impeccably cold. The High Council used the public discord as a convenient pretext for protective custody, declaring the couple a severe risk to the Crown's peace. They locked Kaelin and Ilara within the palace conservatory, abandoning them entirely without servants or contact with the outside world. For 6 grueling weeks, the isolation was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the central irrigation fountains. The vast, glass-domed chamber was thick with the suffocating scent of blooming jasmine and the heavy musk of damp earth. It was an environment deliberately designed to break the mind through creeping claustrophobia. But the council had profoundly underestimated the discipline of their captives. The conservatory was not a greenhouse, it was a laboratory of financial vengeance. Every morning, Ilara sat beneath a massive canopy of weeping ferns. The black leather cover of the Thorn ledger was pressed open upon a wrought iron garden table she had repurposed as a desk. She methodically audited the brutal mechanics of their own imprisonment. The unnatural heat in the conservatory was maintained by immense underground furnaces. Calculating the precise cost of the imported coal required to sustain this equatorial heat against the bitter Ethelgard winter, she traced the stolen funds. It was an astronomical daily expense that could not be hidden. By cross-referencing her father's old debentures, with specific wax seals discarded near the grates, Ilara mapped a stunning network of theft. She wiped a bead of condensation from her forehead, her ink-smudged fingers moving swiftly over the rough parchment. The funds paid out matched the exact deficits in the Northern Defense budget. The corrupt cleric was liquidating the Treasury's emergency reserve, routing the military's lifeblood directly into botanical vanity. She recorded a specific entry from the 3rd of March, where 400,000 crowns had been diverted from the garrison's grain supply. The money had been used to import exotic soil, for the very orchids blooming brilliantly above her head. She recorded every observation with salvaged charcoal, filling the ledger's margins with a damning cartography of treason. She was weaving a tight noose of numbers, and the arrogant council was blindly supplying the rope. While Ilara audited the complex economics of their confinement, Duke Kaelin Northwood measured the martial rhythm of the surrounding palace. He did not succumb to the heavy lethargy of the damp air. Instead, he maintained his physical edge through a silent regimen of daily exercises. Ilara would often pause her complex calculations to watch him move through the humid space. The heavy thud of his leather boots on the flagstones provided a steady percussion to her scratching charcoal. His white linen shirt clung to his back, thoroughly soaked in sweat, yet his precise movements never once faltered. When he finished, he stood perfectly still by the reinforced glass panes, tracking the halberd-bearing sentries below. He memorized the palace guard shifts, his mind a flawless instrument of tactical observation. 12 minutes between the crossing of the Royal Guard in the Eastern Quadrangle, 14 minutes during the change of the watch at the sounding of the midnight bell. 6 crucial seconds of blind spot when the sentries turned the southern corner of the courtyard. The sharp, metallic tang of his discipline served as a grounding counterpoint to the floral rot of the room, keeping them both fiercely anchored in reality. The long days bled into a strict, unyielding routine. They communicated in the clipped, precise language of professionals analyzing a battlefield. 3 shipments of obsidian coal this week, Elara would note quietly, holding up a shard of blackened fuel. The arch-prelate is laundering the defense budget to fund his private guard before the winter ends. Kalen would respond with equal detachment, his gaze fixed on the courtyard below. The outer wall sentries have been reduced by half in the last 4 days. The council fears an internal uprising more than a border breach. They were sharpening themselves against the unyielding stone of their isolation. The afternoon sun frequently turned the glass house into an unbearable furnace, yet neither voiced a single complaint. To yield to the physical discomfort was to forfeit the invisible war. They forged a quiet rhythm together, a shared art of survival measured by the scratching of charcoal and the silent pacing of a general without an army. It was a strange domesticity built on absolute, unshakable competence. Elara found a profound peace in the scent of Kalen's sweat mixed with the jasmine, recognizing it as the smell of honest labor in a palace overflowing with thieves. Late one evening, the oppressive heat finally broke as a violent winter storm lashed aggressively against the glass dome above. Kalen stood at the edge of a shallow, reflecting pool, the white linen of his shirt stark against the dark, creeping ferns. He looked at the jagged scars on his forearms, earned on the freezing plains of the north, and then turned to look at the woman who had weaponized her own shame to save him. "You destroyed your good name in that ballroom, Elara," he said quietly, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the drumming sound of the rain. "The council will undoubtedly use your words to justify a forced annulment. You could have feigned ignorance, and you would be entirely free of this burden." Elara did not look up from the heavy dark book. She carefully aligned a long column of figures, ensuring every stolen crown was perfectly accounted for. "I am a thorn, Kalen," she replied, her voice perfectly level, betraying none of the physical exhaustion sinking into her bones. "We do not value a name that is merely an ornament for a ballroom. We value the meticulous stewardship of the truth. If I had let the tragedy unfold, my family's ledger would have remained a secret, and the North would have starved in the dark." She closed the book with a hollow, authoritative thud that echoed sharply across the water, a matter of survival, not of reputation. She stood slowly, a faint tremor in her hands finally betraying the profound depth of her intellectual exhaustion. In the forced domesticity of their confinement, the social masks they had worn in the ballroom finally dissolved completely. They silently shared the history of their respective scars. His were of iron, ice, and brutal battlefield survival. Hers were of ink, ash, and the quiet, crushing humiliation of a ruined estate. Kalen stepped away from the reflecting pool, smoothly closing the distance between them. He looked intently at the dark ink stains on her fingers, the permanent mark of her relentless labor, and reached out to gently touch them. His hand was warm, heavily calloused, and rough against her pale skin. It was the solid touch of a man who intimately knew the true value of hard work. "I came to the ruins looking for a respectable name to hide my ambitions behind," he whispered, his silver eyes fixed intensely on hers. "I did not realize I was looking for the one person who could see me entirely without the armor, who could measure my worth without a sword in my hand." Elara leaned ever so slightly into the silence, her rigid spine losing a fraction of its defensive, unyielding tension. She allowed herself to feel the solid warmth of his presence. "We are both fragments of what we were meant to be, Kalen," she spoke, a rare, haunting note of vulnerability softening her strictly formal tone. "They think our ambition is a fire that will consume us both," she continued, stepping closer to him, the ledger held firmly against her chest like a heavy shield. "But a thorn and a northwood do not burn. We endure, we quietly rebuild. And when we finally leave this room, we will not be looking for their permission to rule. We will be looking for their unconditional surrender." Kalen did not smile, but the fierce, unmistakable glint of pride in his eyes was brighter than any traditional declaration of love. He saw her not as a political pawn, nor merely a wife, but as the brilliant sovereign architect of his ultimate victory. As the final week of their confinement slowly bled into the grey, unforgiving light of a winter dawn, the heavy iron bolts of the conservatory doors suddenly groaned in their rusted sockets. The harsh metallic scraping signaled a rapid transition into a far more dangerous arena. Elara tightened her grip on the black leather of the Thorn ledger. Her dark-stained digits rested precisely over the exact entry where Archprelate Valerius had signed off on the theft of 400,000 crowns from the Northern Defense Funds. The grueling isolation had tempered their alliance into something vastly superior to the blood ink of the Crimson Covenant. They stood side by side in the center of the damp room as the royal guards approached, their postures perfectly mirroring one another. They were two sovereigns who had seamlessly weaponized the silence of their prison to meticulously map the destruction of their enemies. The public trial before the High Council was only hours away, and for the first time since she had stood alone in the freezing ruins of her ancestral home, Elara felt the heavy ledger of her life tip toward a definitive, absolute victory. The march from the palace conservatory to the High Council chamber was a cold, mechanical progression of iron and stone. The royal guards did not speak, their faces hidden behind the steel visors of their helmets, their footsteps creating a rhythmic, hollow percussion that echoed through the vaulted, lightless corridors. Lady Elara Thorn walked with a straight, unyielding spine, her fingers tracing the heavy, cold brass lock of the Thorn ledger. The book was a physical weight against her ribs, anchoring her to the present reality. She paid no attention to the guards. She ignored the tapestries of forgotten kings that seemed to watch her with faded, judgmental eyes. She counted the paces. 342 steps from the glass doors of her prison to the threshold of the judgment hall. It was a matter of distance, she thought, her heart rate remaining as steady as the ticking of a clock. To surrender to fear was to surrender control. Beside her, Duke Calen Northwood moved with a predatory, suppressed energy. His crimson cloak was a sharp, defiant contrast to the grey gloom of the palace architecture. He was a man prepared for a siege, his jaw clenched, his winter-grey eyes scanning the shadows. He was walking into a theatre of administrative execution, yet he carried himself like a sovereign who had already won the war. They did not speak, they did not need to. The silence between them was an architecture of absolute trust, forged in the freezing ruins of Thorn Manor. The double oak doors of the chamber swung open with a heavy, groaning sound. The hall beyond was thick with the cloying scent of frankincense and the suffocating warmth of 1,000 flickering beeswax candles. It was a room designed to intimidate, built of dark mahogany and polished marble that reflected the golden light like stolen coins. The High Council sat in their elevated semicircle, a row of 7 men whose power was measured in the scratching of quills and the quiet manipulation of Aethelgard's gold. Archprelate Valerius Hallowell occupied the central seat. His white silk robes shimmered under the light of the massive crystal chandeliers. He did not look like a judge. He looked like a man who had already decided the final tally of an execution. The air in the room was heavy with the collective anticipation of a public ruin. Elara noted the millisecond delay in the councillors' movements as they stood. It was a microscopic fracture in their arrogance, a sign of deep-seated hesitation. The Thorn ledger in her arms felt less like a book and more like a loaded weapon. They thought they had cornered a helpless relic, but they had merely invited their own auditor to the table. Valerius did not waste time with the traditional protocols of a greeting. He leaned forward, his gold rings clicking against the polished mahogany table with the sound of bones striking wood. Duke Northwood, he began, his voice a smooth, oily tenor that carried the sting of a calculated insult. You have been brought here to answer for the heresy of the mind that your Duchess has introduced into this court. You were given a path to the regency, a path of ancient lineage and quiet stewardship. Instead, you have allowed a woman of a branded house to turn this palace into a laboratory of financial treason. He paused, his gaze shifting to Elara with a cold, analytical hatred. He hated her because she was competent. She understood the language of the soil, the grammar of water, and the slow, patient syntax of a perfectly balanced ledger. "The council has deliberated," Valerius continued. "We recognize that you, as a soldier of the North, may have been misled by her technical manipulations. Therefore, we offer you a restoration of your solitary honor." The archprelate reached into a velvet-lined box and produced a heavy vellum document, its edges gilded and its surface pressed with the massive gold seal of the high priest. He laid it onto the table between them. "This is a decree of spiritual nullification and immediate succession," Valerius spoke, his voice dropping to a register of absolute certainty. "It grants you the regency and the crown of Aethelgard immediately, without the need for a co-sovereign. It bypasses the lex regia. It makes you the absolute ruler of this empire." He paused, his eyes narrowing into thin slits of venomous light. "The condition is simple, Duke. You will sign this decree, which includes an order for the immediate execution of Lady Alara Thorne for her familial heresies against the High Council. 1 year of pretense ends tonight. You get the kingdom. We get the silence of the Thorne line." The room fell into a silence so profound it felt as though the very air had turned to ice. The suffocating heat of the candles was replaced by a glacial dread that seemed to emanate from the 7 men. Cailan did not move. He stood perfectly still, a monument of martial restraint. His winter-grey eyes fixed on the document that represented everything he had fought for since the day he was cast out. She cast no glance in his direction. She did not beg for her life. She did not reach out to touch his arm. She simply counted the rhythm of his breathing, measuring the depth of his character against the weight of the gold seal on the table. A matter of loyalty, not of emotion. She had read his scars and understood his silent vows. Cailan stepped forward. His military boots rang on the marble floor with the finality of a gavel striking wood. He reached out, his calloused hand hovering over the pristine vellum. The Duke picked up the document, the thick parchment rasping against his leather gloves. Without a single word, he turned toward the massive central brazier that stood in the middle of the hall, its coals glowing with a deep, furious orange heat. He did not hesitate. He did not read the terms. He dropped the decree directly into the center of the fire. The vellum curled instantly, protesting in a hiss of smoke, the heavy gold wax of the high priest's seal melting into a bright, liquid puddle of failure. The high priest's decree was not a mandate of heaven. It was a contract of cowards, and it burned like cheap kindling. "Aethelgard will have 2 rulers or none at all." Cailan spoke, his voice a low, resonant rasp that cut through the crackling of the flames. He stepped back to stand perfectly parallel to Alara, their postures a mirror image of sovereign defiance. "You offered me a crown built on the blood of the woman who rebuilt my house. You thought I would trade the only integrity I have left for a seat in a room full of vultures who have forgotten how to count." He looked directly at Valerius. "The offer is rejected." The trial ended not with a verdict, but with a stalemate that stretched into the freezing depths of the following months. For 8 long weeks, the palace of Aethelgard remained suspended in a state of frozen tension, a kingdom holding its breath. While the High Council remained locked behind their oak doors, debating legal technicalities to strip the couple of their titles, Cailan's loyal northern garrison took up positions just outside the city walls. Alara did not waste this time in idle waiting. She spent the long transition from autumn to winter, methodically auditing the palace's internal supply chains from the confines of their heavily guarded chambers. Her fingers were constantly stained with fresh ink, the dim candlelight illuminating page after page of encrypted commerce. Using the damning evidence of the obsidian coal and exotic soil records she had recovered, she mapped the exact routes of the council's embezzled wealth. With ruthless efficiency, she dispatched coded letters through Martha Finch, her loyal maid, cutting off the council's access to the illicit reserves she had identified in the Thorne ledger. She instituted a silent embargo on their private debentures, freezing their assets. By the time the first deep frost of the 11th month settled over the capital, the council's power had begun to hollow out from within. They were wealthy in titles, draped in silk, but they were entirely paralyzed, destitute in liquid assets. The precarious stalemate was finally broken on a Tuesday morning. A royal messenger, dressed in the bruised violet livery of the king's personal household, burst into the Duchess's private study, his chest heaving. "The king!" he gasped, his voice trembling. King Osric Aethelgard has awakened from his slumber. He demands the presence of the Duchess of Northwood immediately. You are to come alone." Elara set down her quill. She carefully closed the heavy cover of the thorn ledger, the brass lock snapping shut with a sharp click. She followed the messenger through the winding, lightless corridors of the inner palace. The king's bedchamber was a cavern of suffocating heat, and the pervasive smell of stale lavender and decaying silk. King Osric lay amidst a mountain of crushed velvet pillows, his face a dry parchment of wrinkles, his eyes two dying embers flickering in the gloom. The room was a stark sensory testament to the High Council's hidden rot. The heavy gold-threaded curtains were frayed at the edges. The silver wash-basin in the corner was tarnished with a thick layer of grey oxidation, speaking of neglected stewardship. "The daughter of the Thorn," Osric whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "I know why you are here. I know what is written in that ledger. The council is a nest of vipers, but I am the one who gave them the poison. I allowed them to feed on Aethelgard's wealth to keep my crown," he coughed. "I can restore you, Elara. I can sign a decree tonight that restores Thorn Manor, returns your provincial titles, and cleanses your family name." Elara stood at the edge of his bed, her shadow lengthening against the heavy tapestries. She counted his shallow, irregular breaths, 12 breaths a minute. "And the price, King Osric?" she asked, her voice level. "The price is the Duke," Osric hissed, his eyes flaring with sudden lucidity. "Give me the military ciphers he has hidden in the north. Betray the bastard, let the council have his head, and the Thorn line rises from the dirt. You can have your quiet garden in Valoridge. Child, why die for a man who is nothing but a soldier with a borrowed name?" Elara looked at the fading monarch. She saw a man trying to balance a ledger that had been in arrears for 40 years. She thought of Kaelin burning a kingdom to ashes just to keep her safe. "I am not looking for a restoration of what was broken, King Osric," Elara spoke, her voice cutting through the stifling heat like an iron blade. She reached into the folds of her dress and produced a small, ancient scroll of yellowed vellum. "I am looking for the fulfillment of the law. This is the Lex Consortia. It is a legal framework from the first era of Aethelgard's founding. It grants immediate, shared regency power to the spouse of a sovereign house." The king's eyes widened. That law was abolished. "It was never abolished, Osric. It was merely forgotten by men who preferred to ignore the power of the women they married." Elara counted smoothly. She unrolled the scroll. Her ink-stained fingers pointing to the silver compass rose sigil. "By invoking this law tonight in the presence of a living king, I seize half of the regency power instantly. I do not need you to restore my house. I do not need your permission to rule beside Kaelin. I have the numbers, I have the historical precedents, and I have the Crimson Covenant." She looked Osric directly in the eye, her gaze an unyielding audit of his failure. "The ledger is finally balanced. You offered me a province to go away. I have taken the throne to stay." The king collapsed back into his pillows, his breath coming in short gasps. He was merely a footnote now. Elara did not wait for his formal dismissal. She rolled up the scroll, turned on her heel, and walked toward the heavy oak door, her black skirts whispering over the cold stone floor. She had entered the room as a daughter of a ruined house. She was leaving it as the co-regent of an empire, marked by the relentless swing of the pendulum in the king's bedchamber. The old order had just quietly ended. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply tightened her grip on the Lex Consortia and walked back out into the shadowed corridors toward the Great Hall, where Kaelin was waiting for her, their shared kingdom finally within their grasp. The Great Hall did not live up to the promise of sanctuary on the morning of the coronation. Instead, it was a cavern of unforgiving light, the sun streaming through high clerestory windows in shafts of dusty gold that illuminated every crack in the ancient granite. It was a cold, brittle morning, the air tasting of frankincense and the biting chill of a winter that refused to break. Lady Elara Thorne stood at the threshold of the heavy oak doors, her fingers tracing the silver compass, rose sigil pinned to her black velvet bodice. She did not shiver against the draught that swept through the stone arches. She gave no heed to the thousands of onlookers who filled the galleries like a sea of whispering silk. She counted the rhythmic thuds of the ceremonial drums, measuring the pulse of the empire against the ticking of her own internal clock. 1, 2, 3. A matter of timing, she thought, her posture as rigid as the marble saints guarding the chancel. Beside her, Duke Kaelan Northwood was a monument of iron and restrained violence. He wore the black and silver of the North, his crimson cloak, a silent weight that pooled at his feet. The silvered scar on his jaw was a jagged line of history, twitching as he looked toward the high altar where the two crowns sat upon cushions of bruised violet silk. He looked at Lady Alara Thorne, his winter-grey eyes searching hers for a flicker of fear, but he found only the cold, analytical depth of an auditor. She was not a bride walking to a wedding. She was a sovereign, walking to an audit of the soul. They stepped forward together, their boots creating a single, authoritative rhythm on the hallowed floor. The High Council sat in the choir stalls, a row of 7 men whose power was beginning to fray. Archprelate Valerius Hallowell stood before the altar, his white robes a stark contrast to the shadows of the hall. He held the Book of Rites in his hands, his face a mask of suppressed fury. He had attempted a final coup, placing a hidden militia in the Triforium galleries with crossbows aimed at the Duke. He assumed military force was the ultimate currency. He did not realize Lady Alara Thorne had already devalued his treasury. As they reached the chancel steps, Valerius raised his staff, the iron ferrule striking the stone like a gunshot. Duke Kaelan Northwood, Valerius spoke, his voice an oily tenor fighting for composure. You come before the High Council to claim a regency currently in arrears. The northern tithes are uncollected, the treasury is hollow, and your house is tainted. The council decrees the crown cannot be shared with a thorn. You must stand alone, or you must not stand at all. He signaled the galleries. The faint mechanical click of crossbows arming provided a chilling underscore to his words. Kaelan Northwood did not flinch. He did not reach for the sword at his hip. He waited for a count of 5. A matter of loyalty, Valerius, not of threats, Kaelan responded, his voice a low rasp that carried to the furthest corners of the great hall. On cue, Sir Gareth Blackwood stepped from the shadows of the north transept. He was not alone. 50 men of the Royal Guard moved to surround the choir stalls, their halberds levelled not at the Duke but at the councillors. Sir Gareth Blackwood looked at Alara, a subtle nod passing between them. These were the men whose family debts Lady Alara Thorne had quietly purchased using the Thorne ledger and the Mint's illicit reserves. She had not bought their loyalty with gold. She had bought their freedom with stewardship. She had cleared their ancestral mortgages, turning the council's mechanisms of debt against them. The militia in the galleries remained frozen, realizing the men below were no longer on the archprelate's payroll. The chamber was no longer a theatre of execution. It was a courtroom of insolvency. Alara Thorne stepped forward, her black bombazine train whispering over the cold stone. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek to match the theatricality of Valerius. She produced the Lex Consortia from her reticule, the ancient vellum unrolling with a dry, rasping sound. The crown is not an ornament of gold, Archprelate, she spoke, her voice cutting through the stuffy, incense-heavy air. It is a contract of shared endurance. By the Lex Consortia and the Crimson Covenant, the Regency is a dual entity. To crown one without the other is to invalidate the very foundation of the king's law. She assessed the 7 councillors, her gaze a cold audit of their fear. According to the records of my house, this sanctuary stands on land mortgaged to the Thorne lineage 4 centuries ago. If you wish to discuss heresy, we can begin with the council's failure to pay the ground rent for the last 40 years. The silence that followed was absolute, measured by the rhythmic dripping of a melting candle near the altar. Valerius Hallowell looked at the guards, then at the Duke, and finally at the woman who had dismantled his empire with a book of numbers. He saw the ink stains on her fingers. He realized the militia would never fire. To fire was to kill the only people who held the keys to the treasury. The council was destitute, their assets frozen by Alara's strategic audits. She had uncovered the diversion of 400 Izund crowns into private coffers, and she held the council debt certificates as her absolute shield. Duke Kaelan Northwood turned to Alara, his winter-grey eyes softening with profound respect. He took her hand, his calloused skin warm against her ink-stained fingers. He did not ask for her permission. He simply stood with her. 2 thrones, Valerius, Kaelan commanded, devoid of his earlier predatory edge. One for the soldier who defends the walls, and one for the architect who ensures the walls are never sold. Ethelgard will be ruled by the ledger and the sword, or it will not be ruled at all. The coronation that followed was a ritual of restoration. To see it, the two crowns were placed upon their heads simultaneously, the weight of the silver a physical reminder of the burden they had chosen. Lady Alara Thorne did not smile as the crown of the Thorne matriarchs was settled onto her brow. She did not celebrate. She simply looked at the High Council and noted the exact moment each man lowered his gaze in submission. The balance of power had shifted not through a miracle, but through the meticulous application of logic and the quiet art of survival. As the bells of Ethelgard began to ring, Elara looked at Caolan. They were no longer allies of convenience. They were the co-monarchs of a kingdom they had rebuilt stone by stone. 3 weeks later, the snow began to fall in soft, rhythmic flurries over the charred remains of Thorne Manor. The air tasted of wood smoke and the sharp scent of cedar. It was a late afternoon, the sun a pale ember on the horizon, casting bruised shadows over the blackened ribs of the library. Lady Alara Thorne sat by the small, restored hearth in the center of the ruins, her fingers tracing the edge of a heavy, brass-bound box. She bore no resemblance to a queen. She wore a simple dress of dark grey wool, counting the crackles of the fire, measuring the warmth of the room against the encroaching cold. Duke Caolan Northwood entered the room without a herald, snow clinging to his crimson cloak like frozen lace. He carried the heavy cylinder of parchment he had first brought to her months ago, the deed to Valoridge. He walked to the hearth and stood before her, casting a shadow over the Thorne ledger that lay open on the table. He did not speak of the palace or the thousands of laws they had signed. He looked at the woman who had saved his legacy with nothing but a pen and a straight spine. "The 1-year term of our marriage contract has been fulfilled, Elara," he spoke, his voice holding a rare note of vulnerability. He held out the deed to Valoridge, the gold leaf glinting in the firelight. "The council is broken. The north is secure. You have earned your restoration. This deed is now signed and sealed in your name alone. You are free to take your province. You can have your sun-drenched vineyards. You no longer need to be the architect of a kingdom that hates the ink on your fingers." Alara Thorne looked at the map. She saw the rolling hills and golden coastlines he had once offered as a bribe to a ruined girl. It was a sanctuary where she could hide from the weight of history and the grinding labor of stewardship. She studied the Duke, noting the way he held the parchment. He did not hold it with arrogance, but with the quiet hope of a man, offering her the only thing he thought she truly wanted. He was trying to give her the garden he thought she deserved. A matter of choice, Caolan, not of obligation. Lady Alara Thorne spoke softly, her voice holding the rhythmic pulse of a clock that had finally found its home. She took the map from his hand, her ink-stained fingers brushing against his calloused skin. She did not look at the sun-drenched vineyards. She leaned forward and dropped the deed to Valoridge directly into the center of the hearth. The vellum curled instantly, the painted vineyards blackening in the heat. The gold leaf flared brilliantly before being consumed by the hungry orange flames. The map was not a sanctuary. It was a distraction from the destiny she had built for herself. She watched the smoke rise into the chimney, a final grey ghost of her past disappearing into the winter night. "I spent my life in the dirt of this ruin, Caolan," she said, her voice level and devoid of tremors. "I am not looking for a garden to die in. I am looking for the man who stood beside me when the crossbows were armed. I am looking for the partner who understands that sovereignty is a partnership of the mind and the heart." She stood and walked toward him, the black Thorne ledger remaining on the table behind her, a testament to the history they had rewritten. "The ledger of our lives is finally in perfect balance," she whispered, her hand resting on the silvered scar on the jaw of Duke Caolan Northwood. "My home is not a province in the sun. My home is the empire we built together, and the throne we seized through the quiet art of survival." Caolan Northwood did not answer with words. He did not need to. He pulled her into the silence of his embrace, his crimson cloak wrapping around them both like a shared banner of victory. They stood in the center of the ruin, a soldier and an architect, two sovereigns who had found the truth in the darkness of an ash-stained library. The snow continued to fall outside, a heavy white shroud over the world they had changed forever. Measured by the ticking of the clock in the Thorne ruins, the 1-year marriage had ended, and the eternal reign of the ledger and the sword had truly begun. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply leaned her head against his chest and listened to the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the man who had finally seen her for exactly who she was. They were no longer Lady and Duke, but co-regents of Aethelgard, bound by the Crimson Covenant, and a shared throne that no province could ever replace.